This show is the result of a theory and a fluke. The original goal of this episode was to simply give life to a forgotten name, a forgotten soul, and a forgotten victim of a brutal 1977 homicide that has never had the algebraic equation of her murder balanced on both sides. And for all points and purposes, there is no answer even today. Oh, and one more thing. All details contained herein are of the public record, taken from newspaper accounts, public court records, and literature readily available on the subject. I have no inside information on any of these matters in case anyone suspects that to be the case. All right, now on with the show. So the following podcast owes its origin to the events of August 16th, 1977, believe it or not. 10-year-old me, and I'm dating myself here, was standing on the second floor of my aunt and uncle's Lake Tahoe residence, staring directly out the glass door, hoping my uncle would take me fishing. To the right of me was a television console, and it was playing some sort of show. I distinctly remember the network news breaking in with the sudden news that Elvis Presley had been found dead in the upstairs part of his Graceland mansion. To say the news cycles were cataclysmically rocked is an understatement. Presley's death without the benefit of any remote concept of social media anywhere near the horizon had worldwide reverberations that dwarf the sum total of the coverage of Michael Jackson and Prince combined. But the first few days of the news cycle, particularly the breaking news, were experienced by me between traveling around Lake Tahoe and Reno, Nevada for the next few days. In a sense, I was out of town. In other words, I never saw the newspaper coverage in my own hometown, and, life proceeded, and wall-to-wall Presley meteorite managed to keep affecting the culture. And yet, this podcast isn't about Elvis. It's about the moment surrounding a nearly anonymous 15-year-old girl whose life was brutally snuffed out and ended on the abutment of a bridge at Whiskeytown Lake in Northern California. Well, I found her story while simply trying to mollify my own curiosity about the Elvis-related reactions of my local papers. And there she was, Georgia Ann Ruell, a name that would be quickly forgotten in the horrific mix of Elvis's death, a lack of available clues and witnesses, a possible, who knows, devaluation of her life in light of a perceived vagabond status, and who knows, potential investigative indifference to the brutal death of an out-of-town runaway girl. We'll talk about her story in a minute, but what I didn't know was this, that her death was briefly investigated, or at least considered as a potential victim of a man who was convicted of the 1978 killings and rapes known as the Hilltop Rapist. His name, Darrel Rich, and while not concealed from the public at the time, it is also not a widely known factor in the true crime canon that this particular incident was in any way at least asked about and presumably investigated. So I found out, but I found out the long way, and we'll look at this story from box number 7. On August 12, 1977, the Reading Record Searchlight's largest headline would read, "Woman's Body Found." Right above the headline was a large photo showing Shasta County Sheriff's Agent Rob Wharton questioning three young men who simply intended to make a summertime jump from the Whiskeytown Bridge. Their plans were interrupted when they found a young female wrapped in a blanket and laying on a bridge abutment underneath. This happened because they saw a smudge of blood on the railing, which gave them pause to look down, and there she was. And she was dead. Coinciding with this front page story happened to be a series of fires in Siskiyou County, a rather familiar theme to this area, and more stringently, the recent arrest and planned psychiatric examination of David Berkowitz, known to the world already as the Son of Sam killer. The female happened to be an unidentified Jane Doe as of August 12th, but a primary autopsy statement by Joseph Cohn was able to determine that the cause of death at the outset was, quote, shock and hemorrhage due to blunt trauma, unquote. Then a Bay Area pathologist, a Dr. George Loquin, was brought up to perform the autopsy, and no report was immediately available. So initial statements indicated that the girl was nude, with the exception of a tank top around her waist, which at the cursory level leads one to believe that she had been sexually assaulted at some point during this horrific time. The only clue mentioned in the paper initially was the presence of a high school ring, believed to be a 1976 class ring from Mesa High School in Arizona. Now, this ring on her hand would play into the early assumptions of her age. This postgraduate from high school, possibly 18 years old. Also on her right arm was a tattoo that said, quote, I walked in hell and returned an angel, unquote. She had a peace sign tattooed on her left hand and the name Wayne tattooed inside a shield on her left shoulder. She was described as approximately 5'1", 120 pounds with shoulder-length dark hair. The August 15th edition would run with the headline, Murdered Girl Named, with a secondary smaller font that would say, Lived on the Road. Shasta County agents would deem her a habitual runaway, and she would be named 15-year-old Georgia Ann Ruell, essentially a runaway from her Seattle-based family. Her family would convey that she had been chronically missing to the point that they had to make certain emotional concessions about the matter because they couldn't control those factors. It was stated that she walked with a cane, presumably from an accident on a motorcycle a year earlier, and her cane was indeed found at the corner of Railroad Avenue and South Market Street in Redding. Agents were able to get a read on Ruell's activity through the first half of Wednesday the 10th, where Ruell's sister-in-law compliantly dropped her off in the area, although she was unable to give authorities the exact location because she didn't know the area. Then other details would be released. When Georgia was last seen, she was wearing a tan leather vest with fringe with the Banditos motorcycle logo on the back. And on the front, it presumptively read these words, Barroom, B-I-T-C-H. I spell the word here to maintain the consistency on language on my show. I'll come back to this in a moment, though. Sheriff's deputies set up roadblocks along the Whiskey Creek route, attempting to cull information from regular traffic, looking for clues and any sense of oddities and anomalies from potential witnesses that routinely pass through the area. By August 30th, authorities were working already with razor-thin information. Only mainly vehicles from the scene, described to be a blue or tan converted school bus with painted windows parked along the highway the night before the body was found. Another, a dark color, possibly broken down pickup, and a light colored pickup that was parked directly on the bridge at 10:30 p.m. with the flashers blinking. Also, the victim's purse had been found at the boat ramp some distance from there. Her name would not be mentioned again in print until January 1978 in the part of an article on the regional phenomena of murdered hitchhikers, but no direct focus on her case. As that would be it, a local obituary about her life would give the most detail. And it said graveside services for Georgia Ann Ruell of Seattle will be conducted at 2 p.m. Friday at Mariposa Cemetery. Miss Ruell was found Thursday at Whiskeytown Lake. She was 15. She was born February 23rd, 1962 in Tonopah, Nevada. She leaves 3 half-brothers, Robert Sam of Seattle, Washington, Paul Ruell of Coarse Gold, and Jimmy Carlson of Los Angeles. 1 half-sister, Virginia Espy of Coarse Gold. 2 brothers, Bill Sam of Seattle and Jake Sam of Coarse Gold. Sister Juanita Sam of Seattle. Her mother, Betty Sam of Seattle. Father, George Ruell of Coarse Gold. Her stepfather, Peter Sam of Seattle. And her grandmother, Mildred Crone of Coarse Gold. If you do the math in your head, you'll see this was a family that had somehow been divided down the middle and were split between California and Washington. And thus, it seems the investigative mechanisms attempting to bring justice to Georgia Ann Ruell fell silent, or at least as far as newsprint was concerned at the local level. And maybe it was, indeed, a dead end. See, her name has been in the shadows for 48 years, and when I came across it, something bothered me and ate at me to sort of bring her name into the air once again, and that was my original point. And as I look at the stories, I see a few things that do make me wonder. So 2020 hindsight is only as good as what it is, but there is something that at least never addressed in the papers that I just would chuck out there as my own thinking. 1, the Banditos Motorcycle Club is not a club that would allow their logo to be worn in any fashion unless it was sanctioned. Women and girls that cross multiple sexual liaisons in any of those clubs become known as, quote-unquote, pass-arounds. And a demeaning label like Barroom BITCH may have been affixed as a shaming brand for a desperate young child who was scared and worldly to the core. Was this avenue ever examined? Did anyone ever track the movements of the motorcycle club through the area? If the vest was not found when she was, it could have been a very telling sign. The vest is mentioned in the initial article and never mentioned again. Number 2, and I don't know, but did her investigation die on the assumptive altar of Jack the Ripper? In other words, was there a shelf life for investigative concern based on the fact that she was essentially a hardened vagabond with fleeting connections to family and most likely utilizing sex as a survival currency? Now, I'm not making the assumption that law enforcement actively blew her off like that. Not at all. I'm simply pointing to the potential for a passive indifference that shut things down, kind of like Jack the Ripper's victims were thought to be prostitutes, but most likely were not, although that did not tamp down on the interest. But I think it's the mysterium surrounding him and the letters that really drive it, not so much a concern for the historicity of the women. As I would discover, her case, Georgia Ann Ruell's case, has been on the radar over the years, so that theory of mine really isn't so strong, but I thought I'd lay it here nonetheless. So this is the connection I did not expect to find. Now let me briefly go into a series of events that took place 1 year after the death of Georgia Ann Ruell, a series of events that will eventually be covered as a historical record by this podcast, and probably in depth for maybe 1 or 2 shows, but not today. I need to give the schematic overview before I explain what took place here. Darrel Keith Rich took a Northern California community in Shasta County and set it on its ear with a 2-month-long series of rapes and murders that escalated in both form and fierceness. Not to oversimplify, but he essentially raped and injured 5 women between the ages of 14 to 25 and raped and murdered 4 others, culminating in the August 1978 brutal rape and murder of 11-year-old Annette Seelix, who, after sustaining a series of sexual assaults that tests the mind's ability to comprehend it, was thrown from a 109-foot bridge north of Redding in the middle of the night to hit the embankment, crawled into a fetal position, and died with almost no clothing, only to be found by a fisherman the next day who found her broken body on the shores of Lake Shasta. All I ever knew about the case was what was in the papers and a few living room discussions by family and friends who knew some things about the case. But those 9 women were in the paper daily as victims. As I was discussing this podcast about Georgia Ann Ruell with my daughter, she asked me, have you ever thought about looking into whether or not Darrel Rich committed that murder? Granted, the M.O. seems the same. But it took place a year before the Hilltop rapist began his detectable spree of terror. Well, since the newspaper accounts of Georgia Ruell are sparse, I figured I'd look at some available material to see if anything had crossover value. And I particularly thought maybe the descriptions of Darrel Rich's vehicle would match descriptions of the very few things that were provided as potential connections to Georgia Ann Ruell's death. But I started out with a book called A Season of Madness by Robert Scott. I think it's Robert Frank. The book takes a fairly linear approach to the detail of the crime. It is pretty graphic, but informative. Then, prior to the chapter of the haunting details of the Annette Selig's account, which is the most graphic, the author treats us to a biographical look back in the events of Darrel Rich's life, attempting to explain why he became the monster he became. I do appreciate the author's effort here because he takes you chronologically through each abduction and rape, one at a time in chronological form, and when you know he's going to get to the worst one, he gives you a definite psychological break, although explaining who Darrel Rich is isn't that big of a help. But at one point in the book, the author inexplicably details an account of the day that Darrel Rich met his girlfriend, Darlene Munsinger, in Reading. The date, this is so amazing, August 12th, 1977. For some reason, upon meeting this stranger, he regales her with a story stating that the police were trying to say he committed a murder at Whiskeytown Lake. Now, the book immediately dispenses this as a flight of fancy and proclaims that there were no murders at Whiskeytown Lake. And yet, the front page of the August 12th, 1977 paper was the day an unidentified body made the front page of the paper, one that would be identified 3 days later as 15-year-old Georgia Ann Ruell. Now, when I first read this, knowing my limited knowledge, my blood ran cold. Because in my mind, was it possible that Darrel Rich had murdered someone a year before his escalatory attacks in the summer of 78? Then I went online and I read the transcript to People vs. Rich 1988 on justia.com and came across a couple of interesting accounts. And it seems that during the trial, the jurors were confused about something. I quote, Detective Lambert's testimony during direct examination of Detective Lambert, the prosecutor asked the witness to explain the significance of the written list the defendant had given to Lieutenant Oaf. And I believe that is Phil Oaf, who eventually became Shasta County Sheriff. I added that. Detective Lambert explained how each item on the list referred to the location of a particular crime. The list included 2 crimes with which the defendant had not been charged. Detective Lambert said that no one had been charged with those 2 crimes. At the conclusion of his testimony, one of the jurors asked the court, quote, we just had a list here of apparent admissions. Now all of them are lined up with the charges involved here. Why is that? I would assume that every one of them would be brought up. The court replied, I think that it has been explained to you by the testimony, but I will add the further statement that sometimes charges can't be proved for various reasons, and so they are not made. But we are not involved in that inquiry in this case. Soon thereafter, a stipulation was entered between the prosecutor and the defense counsel and read to the jury. Quote, there are 2 crimes on the list prepared by the defendant that have not been charged. The 2 crimes did occur, and no one other than the defendant has ever claimed responsibility for these crimes. The jury should not concern itself with the reasons these 2 crimes were not charged in the case, unquote. And as harsh as that sounds, it is absolutely part of jury protocol. The judge and the court were basically saying, we realize that you are aware that he wrote down 2 other cases, but mind your business because we haven't charged them. I do get it, but it does leave a lot of questions. So, as a guy with no inside knowledge, and I mean me, and for a guy that grew up recounting this case casually over the years because I lived here, these revelations felt new and unexplored. Why? Because Rich literally had an odd psychological need to keep indirectly admitting his guilt to all of his crimes out loud and in the presence of people with no ability to correctly absorb the information. This became a huge part of the case, and it was a part of witness testimony throughout. The second reason is the previously cited text, People versus Rich, 1988, and I quote again. On September 6th, the defendant took another polygraph examination with Swartz, that would be his attorney, Russell Swartz. Lieutenant Oath drove the defendant from Bernie to Reading for the test. En route, they drove down a road near the location where Annette Edwards' body, she was a victim, was found. The defendant said it bothered him to drive through the area because of, quote, what happened here. Oath said he could not discuss the case. After the polygraph examination, the defendant asked Detective Lambert whether he knew the results of the test questions concerning the murder of one Georgia Ruell. He told Lambert that one of the questions was whether he had thrown a girl off a bridge. He explained that he had thrown a girl off a bridge, but it was not Ruell. On the way back to Bernie, defendant asked Oath if he knew the results of the polygraph test. He told Oath that he, quote, felt much better that he had taken the polygraph and felt he had passed it. He further stated that what he had admitted to was all that he had done. So I read this once, and it did initially read that he was worried he was going to be caught for killing Georgia Ann Ruell, but it does sound like that he is trying to say, I don't know how dependable his words are, but he was worried that since the MOs were similar, that by answering yes to the question of throwing a girl off a bridge, that it was going to lay the responsibility for Georgia Ann Ruell's murder at his feet. And so those generically answering the questions could have possibly led them to something more than his admission of killing Annette Seelix. But if that's the case, and it most likely is what he meant, it is still perfectly reasonable to ask the question, what were the other 2 crimes, the omission of which from prosecution confused the jury? See, this was the first time I had ever seen Ruell's name, and secondly, I had never heard another name ever associated with Darrel Rich, and in this account, it's her name coming from his lips. So it all begged the question, is there available technology that could open her case and possibly check to see if Georgia Ruell's violent exit can be laid at the feet of Darrel Rich 48 years later? I had zero idea. See, my podcast is a look back at the historical record. I am not a true crime podcast, per se, and I'm certainly not trying to make a run at the local authorities high on a freebase cocktail of my own CSI Las Vegas reruns and Dunning-Kruger syndrome. But I am aware that our local law enforcement does encourage help with cold cases. At least that's what it says on Facebook. So I did reach out, and I'll just say this. I have been assured that the case was revisited and reinvestigated as a possibility, as the technological ability to revisit it had developed out of the 1980s, and 70s and 80s. I'm assuming that I'm supposed to interpret that generic statement as, quote, DNA exonerated Darrel Rich, unquote. But I'm not exactly sure. But I guess that's good enough for me. Even though it would have been more enjoyable walking them through my continuum of why for a few minutes instead of being unceremoniously told that my theory was old and busted. So Darrel Rich did not kill Georgia Ann Ruell, but somebody did. Nevertheless, to know that her death is on the radar with Darrel Rich is nonetheless fascinating. Yeah, and at least I tried. I advocated for her in case it had never been revisited technologically. I feel pretty good about that, at least for what it's worth. Not trying to be an activist. It just bothered me. But I know one thing. I would have never learned about this extra dimension to the Darrel Rich case without going by way of a couple of things. One, my daughter's suggestion and her out-of-the-box line of thinking, and the accidental discovery of a still unsolved murder. To this day, she has no voice to tell her fate. Only a headstone in Madera County that testifies to her life. A granite synopsis that just lies quietly in Mariposa Cemetery. Which in and of itself is an understated need to explain the as of yet unexplained violation and murder of a young girl. And I dedicate this show to her memory, to Georgia Ann Ruell. This is box number 7.